both in Cuba and Venezuela, when they talked about African struggle, when they talked about how they saw African liberation fitting into the project of building socialism in those places, they always drew upon histories of African and indigenous resistance to colonialism. The only reason the Cuban Revolution was possible, the only reason the Bolivarian Revolution was possible is because African and indigenous people have been resisting colonialism on this land for centuries. So they're drawing from histories of struggles that are directly related to the modern day struggles of our people in order to build what they're making in the future.
Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Ramiro with Anti-Conquista. Anti-Conquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today we have the pleasure of being joined by Onyesonwu Chatoyer, who's an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. She's also an editor with Hood Communists. Make sure to go to hoodcommunist.org. They have some really good, excellent articles, cutting edge of communism for colonized people. And also, she recently traveled to Cuba and Venezuela. So she's going to tell us a little bit about that, what it was like out there for her experiences. But today, I really wanted to focus on something that a lot of us have been thinking about at Anti-Conquista, which is the understanding of African liberation in Latin America. People often forget that in Latin America, you know, there are nations and there are different races and oppressed nations within those countries. And they tend to view Latin America as a monolith in terms of like, oh, you're Peruvian or you're Brazilian or you're Cuban, without understanding the racial and class dynamic that exists within those countries. You know, with all this stuff going on right now about Fidel Castro and Bernie Sanders and people talking shit about Fidel Castro, and Bernie also being a coward and throwing Fidel and Cuba under the bus, people forget about the racial nature of Latin American and Caribbean countries. And when they're saying that all these Cubans are upset with Bernie in Miami, it's like, which Cubans? You mean the white Cuban slave owners? Like, you know, so that's kind of what I'm hoping we can talk about today. Thank you so much for supporting Anti-Conquista, for doing all the work you do with Hood Communists and the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Onyesonwu, welcome to Anti-Conquista.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Cool. So first, just to start off, how was Venezuela and Cuba? I'm so happy for you that you were able to go. I know you did some amazing work out there. I saw the photos you posted. First of all, why were you there, and what did you learn from being there?
Sure, I'll start with Venezuela because that was the most recent trip. That was about like 2 weeks ago now. I was there for the International World Meeting Against Imperialism that was organized by the Venezuelan Socialist Party, the PSUV. They invited struggling people's organizations from all over the world, all over the world. Like, so I was a delegate from the United States, which I hate representing the United States in any context, but that's where I live. And also delegates from Africa, Central and South America, Europe, Canada, West Asia, East Asia. So they invited struggling people, members of struggling people's organizations from all over the world, political parties, youth organizations, labor unions, and had them all in a space. And basically, the purpose of the conference was to develop a plan to struggle against imperialism in the 21st century. And the imperialism they're talking about is U.S. imperialism. It's Yankee imperialism, which is interesting to me because particularly in the United States, there's like leftists who are like, oh, there's different kinds of imperialism. The United States isn't like the worst kind of blah, blah, blah. But in that space, which is like over 1,000 people from all over the world, everybody was very clear that the United States U.S. imperialism was the primary threat. And so all the discussions were about how to show up in solidarity with Venezuela, how to show up in solidarity with Iran, because those are two of the primary targets alongside with Bolivia right now. How to organize youth in all sectors, indigenous people, African people, women, all sectors of a given oppressed society around the goal of anti-imperialism.
It must have been really cool too, like just the weather and being around your people. It's a nice feeling because when you go to Latin America and the Caribbean, like you feel reconnected with your people. You know, same thing if you go to the African continent or Asia, like there's a sense of solidarity and you're among people who understand colonialism. You don't have to go over things like why it's inappropriate for white people to wear dreads and to culturally appropriate shit, you know, and it's just like it's a cool feeling to be back there, and I'm sure you must have had a really good time. Now, I wanted to ask you, who were some of the people who went, and like what were some of their stories? Because I bet you must have met people, from all corners of the earth, and I'm sure each of them had like their own cool stories about why they were there.
Yeah, like speaking to like feeling like you're coming home, feeling like you're among your people. Like it's been a really long time. Like I grew up on the East Coast in Boston, so there was like a strong Caribbean immigrant community. There are lots of African people that spoke Spanish, and here in New Mexico, there are not. And so being in Venezuela and talking to Africans from Colombia, Ecuador, Honduras, Bolivia, like from all over Central and South America in our language or the colonized language that was imposed upon us was like really, I don't know, affirming and like healing. So yeah, I got to meet a woman who was like a leftist social democratic candidate in the Ecuadorian parliament. I've never met a parliament member that I respected before, so that was cool. I got to meet I got to meet a comrade from Trinidad who is with this organization called Emancipation Trinidad and Tobago. He has a radio show. They like saved. So Kwame Ture was one of the founders of the African People's Revolutionary Party. He's from Trinidad. His childhood home is still in Trinidad. It was going to be torn down, and this organization saved it. And they were talking to me about that campaign. Met comrades from Colombia, Afro-Colombian comrades who are obviously dealing with like intense repression from the Colombian state, outright murder, and lots of like political violence. And talking to them about that and hearing what the conditions there were was like extremely illuminating, and also understanding the connections. Also met like cool Afro-Venezuelan comrades as well, including an anarchist who was in the PSUV.
That's what's up. That's what's
Yeah.
up. That's cool.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, man. I'm hoping that you can do more trips like that in the future, because one thing that me and Ophelia always talk about. Ophelia is my girlfriend, my partner, and a co-editor at Anticonquista as well. We're always talking about like, why are all these like dusty ass white people get to go on all these cool trips? Meanwhile, there's, black and brown youth, radical youth in the US who it's important for them to see this, because it provides a model for us in the diaspora to be able to work and to build links with our sisters and brothers back home, and to take inspiration from them, because they're doing like cooler and doper shit than these, like old white academics in the first world. And it's a good experience. So I'm glad you were able to go, and I'm hoping that you can go on more delegations like that in the future. We're actually trying to go to Cuba ourselves soon, so hopefully we'll be able to do that.
Yeah, that like speaking of like so the anti-imperialist movement in the US is mostly old dusty Europeans.
Right. They're cool though.
They're consistent. That's what I'll say. They put in the work. But
Right.
the delegation to Cuba, the Visítanos Brigade, which I was on this past summer of 2019, was 300 people. Probably like a third of them were African, which is incredible. Like Africans of all ages, and then the remainder were indigenous people, a small remainder, and like the majority was like the Europeans. So I'm not gonna say they're dusty because they were nice.
But they're nice, dusty people.
They're nice, dusty people. But like when I was learning about the Cuban Revolution, when I was on the Visítanos Brigade, when I was seeing the experiences of Afro-Cubans, I was like, we are the ones that need this information. Like the colonist people in the United States who are trying to win or wage anti-colonial struggle and wage revolution in the United States are the ones that need to learn from the example of the Cuban Revolution. If you're like, in your 60s, 70s, 80s, and you like paid out of pocket for the trip, you're not going to get as much from it as like a youth who's like struggling against police terrorism, struggling against gentrification, struggling against like settler colonialism in the United States, who's like actively engaged in that work.
Yeah, exactly. No, for sure. No, and I wanted to get into like, for you yourself, like, so you said you grew up on the East Coast. Where's your family from? Where were you born? And obviously, I know you have Garifuna Heritage. So like, tell us a little bit about that. Like, how has that played a role in your life in terms of fighting for African liberation? Because although the Garifuna people have Afro-Indigenous background descendants, their struggle is so connected with what's going on in places like Colombia, in places like Brazil, where there are entire black African regions that are being displaced by multinational corporations, by right-wing paramilitary death squads, by these forces that want to commodify, steal the cultural capital of the African people, sell it back to them, and kick them off their own lands. And so I know for you personally, I just wanted to ask you, like, how has your Garifuna heritage played a role in the activism that you do today?
Yeah, so my family's from Honduras. My father's from Haiti. My mother's from Honduras. I grew up with my mother, and our culture is Garifuna culture. I was born in Honduras, and our culture is Garifuna culture. So, like, one important thing to understand is that Garifuna we're in Honduras, we're in Nicaragua, we're in Guatemala, and we're also in St. Vincent. And we're always in like coastal territories, like prime real estate for people that are trying to build resorts, and prime real estate for people that are like trying to create plantations, extractivist enterprises. And so, because we've been there for hundreds of years, because we have ancestral ties to that land, it's not hard. It's hard to get us off of it. And so, there's been like a concentrated attack in Honduras, particularly after the coup in 2009, orchestrated by the Obama administration that put in the dictator that's in power now. There's been an orchestrated effort to systematically dispossess Garifuna people of our land in order to allow like Canadian tourist companies, Canadian mining companies, U.S. mining companies, U.S. Produce companies to take that land and use it for capitalist enterprise. And so right now we're living in a context where like the same way that African youth in the United States are like shot down like by the police like dogs, the same thing is happening to Garifuna youth in Honduras, except there's much less outrage. It just happens at night. Like every so often you'll see a corpse on your feed of like of a kid that got murdered by the DEA or got murdered by private security forces. And that's just like the day-to-day reality. But there is like intense resistance. We are an African people, we are an indigenous people, and so that means we have a close tie to our land and we have a long history of struggle. Garifunas are like Maroons, meaning that they escaped slavery and formed an independent settlement, and so they've been free for a long, long time. So they're not just going to take it when someone comes in and takes their shit. So they've been like organizing, squats and like reclaiming territory and like fighting back in like militant ways, and also making connections to global struggles to like increase the profile of the Garifuna struggle. Like a person who's really instrumental in doing that is Miriam Miranda of Ofrene, who's been traveling the world and talking about Garifuna struggles, traveling the world, and trying to bring light to what's happening in Honduras, and also trying to pressure the U.S. government to stop supplying arms and training to Honduran security forces that are killing Garifuna people.
Yeah, that's so true because I was recently in Honduras and I was in Tela where there's a big Garifuna community, and it's insane to see the level of displacement that's going on of Garifuna people from their lands where they have lived for centuries. And a lot of forces that are there today are Canadian tourism companies like Garivida that are building resorts in the area, and also the palm oil industry. You have the entire coast. Like I was driving, down the coast of Tela on the way to La Ceiba, and literally the whole entire coastline was palm trees, like the palm oil trees, and they're kicking people off of their land so they can grow crops that are actually bad for the soil. And it just shows you the interconnection of like how African descended people in Latin America bear the brunt of the horrible atrocities of capitalism and imperialism, where they're literally kicked off of their lands so that they can create commodities on those lands that aren't meant to be there and mass produced for people in the first world to consume. And it's just like you see it all circle back, all together. And I'm glad you also mentioned Maroon Societies because people forget that just as there are black belts in the U.S. region, the black belt in the U.S. where African descended people have been based, there are black belts all over Latin America. The Honduran coastline being one of them, the Pacific coast of Colombia and Ecuador being another one, Venezuela. And so I wanted to ask you, like, what are Maroon Societies, first of all? Because that's one of the things that we're never taught about in schools. Like, I never learned about that in school. And I just started learning about it recently, and I thought it was really cool. So what are Maroon Societies, and what role have they played in the history of, like, Latin American Revolution?
So Maroon societies are independent settlements formed by African people, oftentimes alongside or with indigenous people, African people that escaped slavery and decided they obviously couldn't go back to Africa because they took us 1,000 miles away from our home. And so they decided to form like independent African settlements all over the Western Hemisphere. So wherever slavery happened in the Western Hemisphere, which includes the United States, which includes Mexico, which includes Central and South America and the Caribbean, there were Maroon societies. And the largest and most successful were in Central and South America.
I know there was one in Mexico I was recently reading about. There was this guy named Gaspar Yanga. Yo, like I found out about his story, and I'm like, yo, someone needs to make a movie about this guy and the Maroon Society that he created. It's just a beautiful story.
Yeah, it's one of the first free African settlements in Mexico. I think it still has his name to this day, Yanga. So yeah, he's someone that you never hear about. Like when it comes to enslaved African uprisings in general, you probably hear about like Amistad and Nat Turner, and like that's it. But the fact of the matter is that we were up resisting slavery for the entire transatlantic slave trade, and it was our resistance that ended the slave trade. That's like a whole other conversation. But point is, we formed Maroon these independent settlements wherever we could exist. One of the lesser known ones was like the Great Dismal Swamp in Florida. There's also where the Black Seminoles were. There's also the Quilombo dos Palmares in Brazil. There's also, oh God, what's the name of the one in Colombia? I don't remember. But there was in Colombia, in Honduras, in Guatemala, throughout Central and South America, throughout the United States.
It's such a cool history, and it also is interconnected with the revolutions that took place in the early 1800s. Like for me, I was in Haiti twice last year, and I was able to cover some of the protests that were going on. And for me, it was just a beautiful thing to see the history of Maroon societies in Haiti, because the area was like one large advanced Maroon society. Haiti is one of the most mountainous parts of the Caribbean, and the mountains have been where the organizers of the Haitian Revolution declared they had a ceremony that ties back to West African tradition, voodoo, and they had a ceremony in the mountains of Haiti where they declared the Haitian Revolution, and it was a really beautiful thing to see how it's connected with today, the history of Maroon societies. And I wanted to ask you like about the connections, because I know in Haiti, for example, in around the 1804 Haitian Revolution against the French, it was one of the biggest defeats for such a imperialist colonization force like France. And it inspired uprisings in Louisiana, which is not too far from Haiti. So I wanted to ask you, like, why is it important that we learn about revolutions that took place, like in Haiti, African revolutions? And we see that happening in Louisiana. So why is it important that we like reclaim that history?
The way I always put it is that every person of African descent in the Western Hemisphere owes Haiti a debt. And they owe Haiti a debt because the Haitian Revolution struck fear into the hearts of colonizers throughout this entire territory. Once they saw that African people in Haiti defeated the French army and the British army with improvised weapons, with stolen weapons, drastically outgunned, all they had was superior organization and a will to be free, and they defeated these empires. Once European colonizers here saw that, they were like, these people are going to get ideas. And then after Haiti won, and after they formed the first free independent nation in the Western Hemisphere, they opened their borders. They said to any African person in the United States, in Central and South America, if you can make it to our shores, you will be free. And they did the same thing for indigenous people as well. And they also assisted anti-colonial struggles, anti-imperialist struggles in Central South America as well, like in Venezuela. So Haiti was like an example of what African people were capable of when we decided we were going to be free, and we were decided we were going to engage in armed struggle to be free. And that was like really terrifying for colonizers. But Haiti was also an example of international solidarity, of internationalism after they got their freedom.
It's so true. We have to recognize Haiti, and that's what pisses me off within the Latin American left, is just because of chauvinism, the historical arrogance of white, more people who are more on the white side in the spectrum historically, that they just fail to give Haiti its place as the mother of revolution in the Americas. And like you said, without Haiti and Dessalines and Toussaint, it would have been impossible for the rest of the Latin American countries to win so-called independence, right? Because I know we both know that it was kind of like an informal. It just initiated like capitalism and the liberal bourgeoisie and stuff like that. But it was still a progressive advance in history, and people often forget to mention Haiti as like the center of revolution at that time. And so I also wanted to get into like who are some authors that or even historical figures that people in the African diaspora, both from Latin America and the Caribbean, but also the African diaspora in general, who should we like look into and study? Like, for example, CLR James has that book about Black Jacobins, about the history of the Haitian Revolution. Although I have some disagreements politically with him on other things, which is fine, right? That book is one of the most important books to read if you want to really understand the class nature, the proletarian nature of the Haitian Revolution. So like people like CLR James, who else can we look into? Like Walter Rodney, and I know there's a few others that you probably have in mind.
In terms of like history of struggle in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Walter Rodney definitely, How Your Brother Developed Africa, and also Groundings with My Brothers, for how learning about how he organized in his specific context rather than just like the history of Africa. Also, Eric Williams wrote this book, Capitalism and Slavery, that like very, very clearly traces the connection from chattel slavery to the globalization of capitalism. So that book's super important. In terms of like the diaspora in the Western Hemisphere, Asada Shakur is like a really accessible author who makes clear connections between capitalism, between the settler colonialism, and like the expansion of the United States. Her analysis gets no credit. Like people kind of like quote her out of context a lot of times, but she gets it. She makes it extremely plain, and she makes the connections very clear.
Yeah. Claudia Jones, pretty cool.
Yeah, Claudia Jones, Trinidadian comrade, Pan-Africanist, communist, wrote End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, which talked about the triple oppression of African women, our oppression on the basis of gender, class, and nation. Way before intersectionality was a thing, Claudia Jones is talking about the intersection of our oppressions.
Yeah, it's cool to see the history because a lot of times people forget that like so many revolutionaries have roots from Latin America and the Caribbean, like Kwame Ture, from Trinidad, Walter Rodney from Guyana, who wrote "How Europe Underdeveloped Africa," which is such an important work. And it seems like because Africans living in Latin America and the Caribbean who have been living there for centuries, they're able to, on the one hand, experience the oppression of African Americans in the U.S., but also understand it within the context of global imperialism and the transnational struggle. And I feel like it was really inspiring to see, like, to hear Kwame Ture's speeches about the need for internationalizing African struggle. Because I know, like, today there's all these movements coming out, like ADOS and stuff like that, that like promote just like reparations for some people. Why do you think it's important that we fight for reparations for all African and indigenous people?
Because the United States, not just the United States, but all of Europe and like most transnational corporations all owe the entire African diaspora and the continent. The fact of the matter is that the transatlantic slave trade was only one phase in the colonization of Africa and African people. First, they took away like millions of able-bodied African people, and then the space that opened up allowed them to colonize the continent. So like the people who enslaved our ancestors in this hemisphere were like related to the same people that were enslaving our ancestors in Africa. We're creating settler colonies in Africa. We are still looting Africa to this day. And so the idea of like separating reparations or the struggle for reparations or the African liberation struggle into like these borders that were defined by colonizers makes no sense. It makes
Yeah.
no sense because it's the same people looting Africa. It's the same people looting Central and South America. It's the same people who are killing us in the United States. It's the same people who are doing the same thing. So that means we all have the same claim against them. And it's stronger if we do it together.
Yeah, that's so true. And we need to be able to unite the struggles because I was reading about recently the history of U.S. imperialism in Nicaragua. And on the coastline, historically, on the Caribbean coastline of Nicaragua, there's also been Garifuna communities. A little further south have been non-Garifuna but African descended communities. And it's interesting because in the mid 1800s, you had this guy named William Walker, who was this racist white Confederate guy, who he's from like Kentucky or some shit, and he probably would watch NASCAR and vote for Trump if he were alive today. But he was just the kind of guy who they called him a filibuster, and what he would do is just go to like extremely poor countries, try to take them over, and he tried to do that with Nicaragua basically. And one of the places where he landed in Nicaragua on the coast is where today what is known as Bluefields, which was also a British colony where there's a lot of African descended Nicaraguans. And so he wanted to control that area so that he could bring enslaved people from the U.S. Confederacy to Nicaragua to work alongside African enslaved Africans in Nicaragua and control that area for the canal so that they can access the Pacific Ocean, and then send enslaved Africans to California where the gold rush was taking place so that they could mine for gold. And just like you said, like, it's hidden from us because it's the same people who are colonizing African descended people in the US and in Latin America and the Caribbean, but we're trained and programmed to understand the struggles as different and separate because of these false nation state borders. And so like historically it's really interesting to see how the enemy has been transnational, and so now it's up to people, for us, like, to actually build a transnational movement. Um, and on that topic, I just wanted to ask you, like, we talked a little bit about what's going on in Honduras with the oppression of African descendant people and Garifuna people. What have you, based on especially from what you heard from people in Venezuela who went to the conference, people who were from like places like Colombia and Brazil and Panama, what are some of the interconnections there that are taking place?
Definitely extractivism, definitely theft of land. Corporations, transnational corporations coming into areas that are majority African people, majority indigenous people, and stealing the land, destroying the water, destroying the subsistence crops, like just taking land out from under people and like destroying an entire culture in the process. Like that is like across Central and South America, that is the most consistent issue. And it's usually Canadian companies. That is the
Yeah.
similarity. And like in the United States, people always talk about Canada like it's like a lesser evil, like it's not a friend in the United States, but that is not the case. Like they're straight up murdering people and stealing land all over this hemisphere.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it gets obscured because people tend to only focus on the U.S., but it's also Canada, the UK, and stuff like that are oppressing. And one of the struggles that was really inspiring for me, I think in 2017, there were some major protests going on in French Guiana, which is still technically a colony of France, which is a majority African descended nation. And almost the whole entire nation was in standstill during these protests that took place in 2017, and it was like a strike. And France, is extremely unpopular there. None of them were rocking like French flags; they were all rocking their flags. And so, like, it's cool to see these movements that are rising up. What do you think about these? Because I kind of group it in the two ways, right? There's like African liberation, Latin America, and the Caribbean. You have like the resistance part of it, right, where you have places like Honduras, Colombia, Brazil that they're still fighting and resisting white imperialism, and then you have like empowerment in places like Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, where advancements are being made within the government that is progressive. And so, what I wanted to ask you is like, what are some of the resistance movements today that inspire you in the region?
Definitely Garifuna land defense. Like they are literally taking back land that has been stolen and like setting up settlements on it and being like, come and take it. Like Garifuna youth. They also have like a radio program, like a guerrilla radio program, not unlike Radio Free Cuba or whatever it's called that they had during the Cuban Revolution, where they have like Pan-African revolutionary messages being broadcast in Garifuna to Garifuna villages, and it's like they're controlled by Garifuna people. It's like really incredible to see, like in response to incredible oppression by this dictator that was put in power by the U.S., that's propped up by the U.S., that's literally murdering people with impunity. There's all these creative forms of resistance and defiance that Garifuna people are engaging in. It just makes you, like, people in the United States can get like really depressed about conditions, like first world problems, but like looking at the persistence and brilliance that's coming out of global South struggles is always really inspiring. Also, Haiti. Haiti has been rising up for like a year straight at this point, over a year straight. It gets no press. Like we hear about Hong Kong, which is like a bullshit protest. We hear about the yellow vest, which like who cares? There's like fascists in it. But
Who
we
gives
never hear
a
about Haiti. Like we never hear about Haiti because Haiti's current president was put in power by the U.S. So that's a dictator that they deal with. They don't say that we need regime change because he is on their side. But Haiti's been rising up continuously for over a year, and they're facing police using live bullets. They're facing tear gas. They're facing U.S. mercenaries, and they still have not backed down.
Yo, Haiti is mad inspiring. Like, just seeing how the people resist, and also, people forget that it's the most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere, and people like, it's such a difference because like you can't compare. I'm so glad you made a distinction between the protests in Haiti and protests in Hong Kong, because unfortunately a lot of times first world people, whenever they see a protest anywhere like in the world, automatically they're like, okay, like good. Which in the case of Haiti, yes, the protests are good because they're protesting against like imperialist backed government. But like when you see the opposition protests in Venezuela, that they're like, we want, U.S. style democracy, and it's just like it's a totally different nature. And what I think is beautiful about the Haitian resistance is just the class nature of it. From day one, it's always been working class. It's always been proletariat. It's led by women. They're fed up with the U.S. They don't want the U.S. anymore. They know, and not just the U.S., France, Canada, and what I think they call like the axis of evil in Haiti that they called it. They're fed up with them. They're not like the so-called Hong Kong protesters or the Venezuelan opposition protesters, and it just shows you that like, even and another thing too is that the left in the U.S. unfortunately has ignored them because they're not necessarily right off the bat saying, we want full communism right now. And people have to understand that it's like, because like once I was able to see the Haitian protesters, you're like, yo, this is a fucking socialist revolution right here. They don't necessarily have to have banners or shirts that say, okay, like this is socialism, but just the because of their oppression as a nation, as a race, as and a class, like it has this pure socialist organicness to it that a lot of people in the West really ignore, and it's something that bothers me, especially with Haiti, just to see that happening.
That's always how we wage revolutions. Like if you look at like Amilcar Cabral, if you look at the anti-colonial struggles throughout Africa, like it was rare that people came out and were like, "We're Marxist-Leninists." Like they didn't really
Right.
do that. They were
Right.
always like, "We want to be free, and we
Mhm.
don't want this system that was imposed upon us. We want to build something that's like human-centered." And so it was always framed in that way. But they weren't taking like these ideological stands that Western leftists demand. They
Right.
were like building the ideology as they went, and they were definitely taking inspiration from like Marx or whatever, but they weren't claiming these labels that are so important to people in the United States.
Exactly. And they're able to blend it, like you said, adapt it to the local conditions to understand that, like, for example, any revolution in Haiti will include the traditions and customs of the West African people who they're descended from the matrilineal nature of like the family structure, especially in Garifuna society as well. It's a matrilineal woman-led, and if you look at the main people in Ofrane as well, which is one of the groups that's leading this movement, it's mainly women. And people need to learn that from them because we're all here like waiting for fucking what Bernie Sanders has to say about. Who gives a fuck what Bernie Sanders has to say about socialism? It's like there's people out there right now in Haiti, in Honduras, in Colombia, and all these places who are doing it, and they get no credit for it. So it's just insane. I also wanted to ask you, like, what are your thoughts about the role of like evangelical Christians and these like Mormons who are going into black nations and communities and trying to recruit them for their like racist churches? Because, for example, in Honduras, there's a big push by the evangelical Zionists to go into the African descended communities to promote their religion. In Brazil, along the coast of Brazil, there's also these right wing evangelicals who are trying to recruit. In Haiti, I saw tons of missionaries. Like half the flight was missionaries. These old like white dudes. I'm like, what the fuck are you going to do in Haiti? And so what are your thoughts on like these right wing Christian movements that are trying to like win them over?
It's like colonized ignition. And it's interesting that you saw that in Central and South America because the same thing is happening in Africa as well. I saw the exact same thing in Ghana, the exact same thing in Tanzania. So like it's an absolutely colonizing mission from the Western imperialist powers. And like all of these like, far right movements that are coming to power in Central and South America, like what just happened in Bolivia, have like this Christo-fascist ideology. So it just seems like an extension of the same old like manifest destiny bullshit where they're like, God wants us to have this land and save the uncivilized savages.
Yeah, and it's promoting this backward like homophobia and transphobia because in people forget that like in African societies historically, they had a different understanding of gender roles, of sexuality that was more advanced than this backward Christian Western white understanding of like the gender binary and sexuality. And unfortunately what we're seeing in places like Trinidad and Jamaica and other places where you see young queer black youth who are being forced into conversion therapy, who are being kidnapped by churches and beat up and assaulted for being gay or trans. And it just breaks my heart and it pisses me off to know that these churches are reinforcing a settler colonial backward religion, and also using the own people to enforce it on themselves. And it just, oh my God, it pisses me off all the time.
Yeah, and then you talk to leftists here or like so-called progressives here, and they're like, "Oh man, the Canadian's so homophobic," and I'm like, "Who did that?"
Right. Guess who brought that shit?
Exactly, that's not us.
Guess who brought that shit over there?
Yeah.
Right.
No, for sure. No, and but I think if we look at places like Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, there's a model for how people of African descent can integrate and work together with indigenous sectors, because me personally, I personally support self determination. I believe that, for example, the Garifuna nation should be able to determine to run the coastline, first of all, to run that economy, because that's also part of the economy, but to decide for themselves. And I think that it's good to have unity with indigenous people as well, in the Americas. And I think, in Venezuela especially, where there's a larger indigenous community, there's a model that's in place that provides a way for our people to come together, African indigenous people, to work and build a socialist economy, to create healthy jobs, to work your own land, to control your own lands, to work your own lands, grow your own food, be independent from multinational companies. So I wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the things that inspire you about the way Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua and others are supporting African empowerment?
I'm really both in Cuba and Venezuela when they talked about African struggle, when they talked about how they saw African liberation fitting into the project of building socialism in those places, they always drew upon histories of African and indigenous resistance to colonialism. Like the left in the United States, when we talk about when there's like talking about socialist history, we go to Russia. But in Cuba and Venezuela, they stay here, and they're like the only reason the Cuban Revolution was possible. The only reason the Bolivarian Revolution was possible is because African indigenous people have been resisting colonialism on this land for centuries. So they're drawing from histories of struggles that are directly related to the modern day struggles of our people in order to build what they're making in the future. It's just very it's very, very different than how I'm used to people talking about socialist history. To say
Hmm.
like an enslaved African uprising was a class struggle, an indigenous land defense or like indigenous resistance to Spanish colonizers was like a class and land struggle. Like bringing that history in instead of going across the world for it.
Yeah, and even in Cuba, like Juan Almeida Bosque was a black man who's one of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution, and he was one of the group of people who went with Fidel on the boat from Mexico to Cuba, and he's never unfortunately given the credit that he deserves for his role in the Cuban Revolution. Obviously, the Cuban Communist Party does, but I think a lot of people in the West don't even know who he is, Juan Almeida Bosque, who played such a central role in the Cuban Revolution, and he was Afro-Cuban, and it's beautiful to see how also in Venezuela, there's the central to the defense of the country are black moms, black moms who run their neighborhood, who understand, who are part of the colectivos, who are the most vocal against these imperialist sanctions, because people forget that, like, these US sanctions that the US is placing, like here in the US, right, we hear sanctions and we're like we don't really know what the fuck that is, right? Like people don't really know. But in reality, in material reality, sanctions mean that it's harder for African black moms and indigenous descended moms in places like Venezuela to eat, to feed their kids, and it's never thought about that like that way, and in terms of racism, because that's who it affects the most, is black moms who are trying to feed their kids, trying to survive, and it's just a shame that's often left out.
Yeah, people in the United States haven't really caught up to the modern tactics of imperialism. Everybody's still focused on boots on the ground as like the primary thing to oppose. And so when people are talking about a possible invasion of Iran, it's like very easy to mobilize people. But when you say like sanctions have devastated or crippled Iran's economy, have crippled Venezuela's economy, are destroying the Cuban economy, you can't get people to pay attention because they think sanctions are like a kinder, gentler alternative to outright warfare. But the fact of the matter is sanctions kill many, many more people, as you mentioned, particularly women, children, elders, disabled people than boots on the ground do.
So moving forward, like I want to mention to everybody, please follow Hood Communists, please follow the All African People's Revolutionary Party, please follow all these different groups that are doing some great stuff out there. Black Hammer, shout out to Ghazi, Black Power Ghazi. I know Ghazi is someone who you work with as well, who we both are inspired by. I wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the projects that you're involved with now with Hood Communists and your party, and what are some things that you're hoping to do in the future?
We're just working. So Hood Communists, we have a focus on getting like the political analysis from organizers, like not like academics, not like people who just like kind of observe what's happening, but people who are like actually engaged in struggle, like writing about the lessons and the things that they're observing. So that's what we're trying to focus on. For the All African People's Revolutionary Party and also for Cuba Solidarity, I'm representing on the Venceremos Brigade, trying to organize the 51st. I'm going to be a responsable, which means I'll be like a chaperone on the field trip on the 51st. But we want to bring like a huge contingent of African, Indigenous, and Chicano people on the 51st Brigade from New Mexico. New Mexico has an extremely large Indigenous community, extremely active Indigenous community, but the last Venceremos delegation only had 3 Indigenous people. So we want to see if we can like double that, triple that. So that's like the work we're focusing on now. And then the constant work of the APIP is political education, is educating our people about Africa, about imperialism, about settler colonialism, about the history that we're talking about on this call, and also organizing our people for community self-defense. Because I do not believe, regardless of who wins office, whether it's Bernie Sanders or whether it's one of these other crackers, that our conditions are going to change. I think that we have to organize to meet the basic needs of our community, period, regardless of what the US government does. And so we have to be able to take care of our healthcare, take care of our education, take care of our housing, and also make sure that if people want to come in and if ICE wants to come in and deport people or the police want to come in and shoot someone, that they know that they're going to have resistance. So that's the work we do day to
Yo,
day.
That's so true. Fucking Bernie Sanders, man. Everyone, it's crazy seeing like even on the left, people who like otherwise would have like pretty good understanding of imperialism, still being like, oh well, Bernie. I'm like, no.
he's not
Just
gonna
listen
save
to what
us.
he's saying. People are
Right.
like, oh, he's going to be better. I'm like, listen to what he's saying and look at what he's actually done. Explain to me
Exactly.
how it's different. He always supports use of intervention. He always supports sanctions. He says racist shit about Cuba. He says racist shit about Venezuela. He says racist. He brings up North Korea, and North Korea is like just minding their business. And he's like, North Korea's a dictatorship. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like he's
Like
just
what the
not. He's like
like
not on
people
our
still
side.
have
He's not
their
on our
own.
side.
Yeah.
No, for real, and it's just a shame like to see that. And at the end of the day, it's very. I have a view of it similar to like Brazil. Like in Brazil, there's a white left, and a lot of times, they want to stick to promoting like Germans and all these Euro Brazilians to lead the left. What Brazil needs, they need someone like Mario Franco, right, who was a black queer woman who was objectively like one of the most oppressed sectors of society to represent the people. And I'm sorry, I'm just not gonna follow someone like Bernie Sanders, who is part of like, the same Democratic Party that supported Jim Crow laws, that supported all these imperialist policies. Like, if it was like Asada or something like that, then that'd be a different story. But I'm sure even Asada would be like, I'm not running for that position. We're gonna have a different political program for the U.S. and it'll be revolution and not bourgeois electoral politics.
Absolutely. He's just trying to manage the contradictions of capitalism at a point when it's way too late to do that. And I think people are just gonna have to see it for themselves.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. Cool. Onyesonwu, thank you so much for joining us again. Onyesonwu is an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. Just came back from Cuba and Venezuela. Make sure to check out her articles on Hood Communists. And how can people follow you, by the way, on social media?
On Twitter, it's just my name, Onyesonwu with an underscore. I prefer you follow the All African People's Revolutionary Party because I'm not an individual. I'm a militant in a political organization. So you can find the All African People's Revolutionary Party on Facebook. We're APRP on Twitter and APRP International on Instagram.
Cool. Well, Onyesonwu, thank you so much for being with us again. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora, and we're bringing you news and information and podcasts not from some bourgeois careerist point of view, not from a cracker imperialist point of view, but from our people speaking for ourselves who are generally concerned about liberation for all Black, Indigenous, oppressed, working class people. So I'm so glad that you were able to join us. Thank you so much, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Cool. Thanks for having me.